everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Plant Planet Plate podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Tao, and also we have,
Hi, it's me, Munize.
and today we're going to be talking about Khmer New Year because it is the time to be festive. And what's more festive than food and foraging foods, right?
Yes.
So today we're going to talk about foraging foods, famine, and feasting. We made a few jokes about this is the F podcast of the PPP podcast. A lot of
Well,
alliteration going on.
yes.
But
And it's important, I guess, to mention why we have brought famine into this, which generally is not a link that we would make, but it is because this year is also the 50th anniversary of the fall of Phnom Penh. So it is basically the start of what we would also call Khmer Rouge time in Cambodia. And that sort of brings us into this area of also looking at it in the realms of famine and the link between foraging and famine.
yeah, I was just thinking like the Khmer translations of how when you preface this time, like in a discussion or reflection, it's always Pel Pol Pot or it's Pel Khmer Kraham. So like literally that it's like the time of Pol Pot or the time slash era of yeah, Khmer Rouge. So to start all these like interlinking arenas, I guess we're going to talk about the history of foraging. So the first thing that I immediately think of when I think of foraging is actually a discussion that I had, and I think I've mentioned this before, either like in conversation with you, Munase, or in our podcast before, but the sort of distinctions that we make between what is considered a food and what is considered edible. And where did this kind of distinction start happening in human history? Like, under what conditions? And I always like to think of this wonderful edited volume by the late Dr. Nina Etkin called Eating on the Wild Side. And it's just a process of trial and error. It's a bunch of different case studies put together by different researchers around the world about how foraging took place in the context that they studied. And I just imagined like how the histories or the traditional ecological knowledge that flows through communities and generations is just, it's not hearsay, but to some extent at the beginning it was hearsay because people would be going out to forage and gather foods, or they could be hunting, in that magical, mythical time before agriculture that we like to romanticize for some reason. And
I
someone
think
eats a leaf.
heavily romanticized, I think I would say
Yeah,
at times.
yeah, definitely. And like some would be eating a leaf or something that looks for some reason edible and appealing to them. And whether or not they live to tell the tale, that would be, the indication, that would be the crucial knowledge.
Yeah,
Um,
and I guess in some parts of the world that probably still happens, or there is a lot of show and tell when it comes to foraging, because you are either looking at what other people are doing or you're hearing about it from other people. But ultimately, it's the act of gathering, it's the act of collecting something that is available in the wild, and we can go on and discuss what wild really is. But it's basically not deliberately planted, is how I would say. Which we only get to that explanation because we know what agriculture is. It's the deliberate planting of certain things. So it's the opposite of that, which means it's just around and people gather and they share is foraging.
So way back when, I don't even put timestamps on this because it's such a large, nebulous thing, human history, and getting an anthropologist to talk about the course of human history is always a trap. So I'm just gonna say, like, with a general stroke, when we were banding together, when we were deciding to have more extended relationships, community
Yeah.
kind of foraging, gathering, hunting, you
The
know.
other outdated term is now Anthropocene. I think it's outdated now. People, even geographers, don't use it anymore because it sort of signifies like our control on the earth, whereas we want to find that balance back. So most terms are getting outdated. But yes, it's when humans started to interact with the earth and started to collect and way back when.
So, okay, so that would be just like when the humans showed up, right?
Yeah.
Just for people listening and they're unsure. It's like when did we show up to a specific degree where we started wreaking havoc on all these different ecosystems on the planet? Is that what we're gonna summarize that as our
That's
critique
the
and
one.
overview?
That's the one.
So what have geographers been using since? I've because my encounter with the phrase Anthropocene, I'm thinking like the first time I heard it, I was a master's student, and it was actually a master's student who was doing research on environmental science and sort of like
Yeah.
climate change. And she introduced that to me. So I've always had it outside of anthropology in my brain, even
Yeah, it's
though
very
we
it's
probably
what we
played with it.
yeah. It's quite geographical, but I think there is a rejection of the term. People are trying to reject using that term more and more. I don't know what is going to come in place of that. But it's really sort of last year, it was sort of, they're trying to sort of say this is not the term, but it's still used. They say that it has a very narrow scope of what the history of human impact is on the planet, because it might be one's point of view and not everybody's. Some in this Anthropocene time have had less impact than others. So not all humans have had equal negative impact or positive impact on the earth. So I think it's to
Oh, absolutely. And that has a lot to do with our different technologies and institutions and the way we interact with the planet, right? And one big notorious kind of technology or practice would be agriculture. So, with your background in agriculture and your own personal experiences working, in Cambodia and things, like, I guess my basic question to you, and we can like squabble up and discuss this, of course, but when do you think agriculture became agriculture? Like, what is the definition of agriculture? Is it like you said, purposely planted,
yeah,
not
deliberate
wild?
planting. I think it's the act of the settling down. So it was no longer being so nomadic. It's like shifting in how you sort of claim a space, and then might be semi-nomadic, so might still move around a little bit. But yes, I think it was sort of the deliberate sort of planting, the active kind of planting, and then using the land to provide for you, but not in a foraging way, in a more, I will plant this. And it, yeah, so I think for me that is the beginning of agriculture. But I do want to add something which it only, until sort of very recently starting to do more work in this sphere of plant humanities, I began to realize that, there's not a clear cut that this is when hunting and gathering or foraging ended and this is when agriculture started. It is such a sort of gray area of kind of mixed activity. It continues to be in that same way. How people supplement their diets, particularly in rural areas, is not as clear cut as I guess we were led to believe, perhaps studying in school, where things are simplified. But it's not that one thing stopped and the other began. It was sort of a weaning off and still supplementing diets. Ultimately, it was the human desire to be to feed themselves and feed others, perhaps. But it's nourishment. It might come down to that. It's how can we nourish ourselves?
And I would have to say it's a big shame that we don't have an archaeologist or a biological
Mm.
anthropologist with us, because I think that there's been so much very interesting research done on just sort of the physical makeup of early humans and seeing what sorts of nutrition they received and, looking at their bones and their teeth, the things that they ate, as well as I like to call it junk archaeology, but it's not. It's material culture, right? It's like, what did
Mm.
people leave behind? What sorts of relics did they have in their living space that would indicate their sort of behavior? And recently, exactly, actually yesterday, the University of Oxford wrote a bit of a piece about a new analysis of archaeological data that reveals how agriculture and governance shaped wealth inequality. So this was led by Professor Amy Bogart, who's professor of European archaeology at the University of Oxford, and she found out with her team that high wealth inequality in human societies, like over the past 10,000 years, was encouraged by so-called land-hungry farming practices, where land became scarce. Wealth inequality often grew among households, and where land was abundant, wealth was more equally distributed. So just think of just a big, I don't know, land as a big slice of pie, I'm guessing, and then people just kind of creating and curating their diets and how much wealth they could accrue because of trading food and different things. Um, and I guess I also wanted to say one big comment about sort of the relationship between foraging and agriculture and the people sort of making use of that. Because foraging required like a deep intimacy with the land and a lot of movement. But when we look at it through a plant humanities lens, we often think of it like, oh, humans are going to look for these specific plants, and the plants are kind of sedentary and they don't move, but they actually, through our search for them, we help them spread through like different seeds and stuff that get trapped on our clothes if we are wearing clothes, or even if we pick them up and we like the seeds fall out of it, we
Yeah.
are actively involved in a dynamic relationship with the environment and these plants. So I just don't want
Yeah.
it seem so one-sided, if that makes sense.
Yeah, even stuck under the shoe, like a plant can kind of travel with us. So it's true that it can be a two-way street in that way that, we are moving with the plants, but the plants also move with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that we've kind of shifted to agriculture and we've got this, I don't know, collection of tasty plants, and some maybe even fungi, and like it's really important because now we have chances to really make culinary choices, right? And that we have what we understand to be deeply nutritious things, or at least tasty things in access, like easy access. So we kind of have this, shift from foraging to survive and expending a lot of energy and a lot of time, right? Gathering what we need to being more sedentary, being more settled down, and having greater nutritional availability. And also dietary diversity, because maybe you have more starchy things, more legumes, and maybe you still forage a little bit, but just to have a bit more dietary diversity, even.
Yeah, I would say that it also kind of that act of planting and then being, that there's a thing called listening to the land. It's quite um, once again sort of revival in some agriculture spaces, or I would say sustainable agriculture spaces, where it allows you to see how the land responds. And I'm assuming like the early planters probably planted in that way. They they probably learned a lot from the space that they were in, realizing that, okay, this is the shape of the land, this is where the sun is rising and things like that. Whereas modern day farming, like monocultures and things, it sort of negates all of that. You kind of sort of make those things not matter much because you know that you can pump chemicals and whatnot to get the plant to do what it does for you. Whereas early forms of agriculture, which I wouldn't necessarily say they were monoculture, but it was the act of planting and growing for yourself. Still subsistence farming would require a lot of change in relationship with how you are with the land. You would still learn a lot. You would know about seasons. You probably learn a lot more about seasons than just what plants are telling you. I would imagine.
And we talked in previous podcast episodes about that kind of strategic companion planting. I think that's what it was called, where you kind of plant, what was it, corn, beans, and what else was it?
The
The three
the
years.
three sisters, corn, beans, and it's like squash, I
Yeah, I
think.
think it was
Yeah,
squash. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, that's the type of kind of knowledge, that traditional ecological knowledge that you find from listening to the land and could be shaped also by what you're wanting to eat, right? And like you may grow these next to each other and realize they harmonize very well in the soil, and you think, wow, we should do this more.
Yeah. I
So,
also mentioned that because in the time that we live, in the kind of things that we consume, particularly through sort of everyday media, where one thing is normally pitted against the other. So foraging is like something beautiful and holistic inside of kind of like taking from the land and sort of, taking what you can. It's whereas agriculture is always seen as this bad sort of, but it's not always bad. It's how you do it. Agriculture is a huge, all-encompassing term. It can mean anything from monoculture to multi-cropping to sort of very different types of agriculture. So, and I guess it's the same thing when we talk about agriculture. We're not necessarily saying that foraging was this old practice and now people shifted to agriculture. It's all changes. It's all little advancements that, you sort of develop over time, much over history. So it takes time and years to kind of perfect it, probably, I'm sure. I'm not a historian, although I have an interest in these things. So yeah,
so with this in mind, like as the frame where agriculture is not perfect, right? I strongly believe that no matter what point of
yeah,
my career that we would be talking, I'd be like, it's not perfect.
no,
But it has, noted benefits and noted downsides depending on how you slice it, as they say. So kind of shifting this to Cambodia, when we think about Cambodia as an agrarian society,
yeah,
uh, when you look at the labor breakdown, it's an agricultural country, right?
yeah,
With so
completely.
much
Still,
rice, so much rice.
so much rice. And I think what's kind of really sort of historically significant is kind of this idea that when the Khmer Rouge came about, their dream or nightmare or whatever that they sort of put their focus towards was this idea of year zero and this idea to have this completely agrarian society. It was an experiment. It was this what I could say a social sort of experiment or economic experiment to just sort of push people out. So when we say, and in the beginning of the podcast, we sort of said fall of Phnom Penh, what we meant really was to people who are not familiar with Cambodian histories, the Khmer Rouge, who were these very communist sort of kind of soldiers and, that came together, flooded into the city, but pushed people out of urban areas into rural areas because they had this vision, this the vision sounds positive, but it was obviously not a positive thing, although it was to them, to create an agrarian society. So they wanted people to farm and they wanted Cambodia to create a lot of rice. And we all know from our history books and one Google search away to know that it failed. It was terrible for the country.
Yeah, an estimated like 20 to 25% of the population was killed in this genocide. And I every time try to wrap my head about this, because my mom went through that, my family went through that, I keep thinking like rice? That was the end goal? Like when I was studying politics and I was studying history, like about communism and communist projects around the world, each has their own kind of flavor, right? It reminds me of the Soviet Union with collectivization,
Yeah,
like growing a large amount of food and then pulling it all together and inevitably causing these ripples of trauma and famine, right? But I kept thinking like the mindset being the Khmer Empire at its peak was the time of Angkor, and what made us special is our rice. And I sound like I'm laughing because I am, because I think it's so what? It's so absurdist to me reflecting back. And when we put this in the context of our work, what I think is really important is that how agriculture and foraging was like sort of this transition for societies all around the world, right? To sort of stabilize. And it's seen as this, I don't want to like romanticize thing like we understand the land, we're listening. And not to say that's not a bad thing to listen to the land and to work with the land and to live in harmony with the land, but where it became this umbrella in which these political agendas could be undertaken in Cambodia. And if you speak to any Khmer person, they will know somebody who has been drastically affected by this, if not themselves and their own
Completely.
family. And the idea of rice being so important to the Khmer way of life and Khmer identity, you can see that in our language. Like,
How
yambai,
many
which is
words for
basically,
rice?
I just, I think it's just types of rice, like specifically. And I think about it because I know ga means like raw rice,
Yeah.
uncooked, and then there's mai, which is cooked, and then
And then
just
there's the rice in the field, and then there's the rice that has been there's plenty ways that rice is described, but it just I guess what we are sort of coming to that is with how important it is in Khmer culture, and I mean at the end of the day, when people ask you, have you eaten? What do they ask you, Tao?
have I eaten rice yet?
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
just it's the main thing, it's the main event,
It's
and
definitely one of our heritage foods. Like the
it,
food mascot of Cambodia is rice.
yeah, and I think it's completely sort of, this was what the agenda was for the Khmer Rouge at the end of the day, to sort of course, yes, make it some sort of ultra kind of Khmer or country organized around the growing of rice. So labor and young people were sort of put to work or in camps. Definitely a failed sort of experiment. But what it does lead now to is a kind of, a way of learning about and studying about things, and a development of a culture that we have now as well. So, whatever we do in Cambodia now as part of our work, it does have a little sort of splash of that, in the sense that you cannot not have it impact the work that we do in any way, small or big. What would you think about that?
So I think that one point that I would like to make is that, rice as a heritage food in Cambodia, and you mentioned all the different types of words that we have for rice and those relationships. There are lots of plants that grow in conjunction with the rice paddy, right? And we've
Yes.
noticed that in our research and also when we speak to people. And this sort of knowledge of where plants grow, these kind of unintentional wild plants, being able to identify them and seeing how they taste and what they pair well with within Khmer cuisine, that has much to do with the the famine context of the genocide itself. So when you have nothing and you spend so much time in the rice field, you start to pay attention and activate those knowledges from times past. And when I say times past, being like the context of which it is most valuable. Because when the fall of Phnom Penh happened, it was, everyone being in exodus to the fields. And most people who were grown up in an urban environment, like my mom included, she didn't have these experiences with like farming or things like that, other than maybe the hop and lut, which she would eat in Phnom Penh, right, to put on
Yeah.
her dishes and stuff. So it was kind of like a really forced context of people needing to survive and this knowledge being so crucial. So it was quite well dispersed, through whispers and over time, because not only was everyone forced into labor camps, the types of food they ate, if any, was quite minimal. They had baba, which is like rice porridge, and it was quite thin. If you go to
Quite
the
thin.
Genocide Museum in Phnom Penh, you can see one of these pots that they have that would feed X amount of people. And it's really harrowing because you look at that and you think, oh my gosh, this is what they ate. Um, but yeah, so I guess my main point is when we relate to foraging and famine and agriculture, we think about that intensification of the need for this traditional ecological knowledge around plants and how we went from a time where it was mildly sort of less important, so less people would probably know that off the top of their heads, to a time where it was crucial for survival. And I would also like to add, for those less familiar with Cambodian history, during the Khmer Rouge regime, there was a dismantling of all these different knowledge structures of education. Like it was a complete social reset, right? Year zero.
Yes.
So biomedical medicine was not allowed. Religion was abolished. Education was abolished. Like all these pillars and institutions that we take for granted were actively dismantled and destroyed, and the people participating in them were killed. So, like when you have that sort of free fall, that sort of downfall, all of this sort of knowledge is passed around with whispers. This is something you don't tell people outright because they want you to die, effectively. That was their design. Um,
And
so
it
that
also then even more, sorry to interrupt, but it also then even more, you know, pushes you away from any form of documentation because you simply just perhaps don't want to be seen or can actually practice any documentation. I think the other thing that really surprises me, and we're still talking about Khmer Rouge, is that everybody wore the same clothes. Like it was that black trouser suit most of the time with the red krama. So this idea of also this lack of color, I think really kind of really gets to me when I think about this, what Cambodian is right now.
Yeah, and to this day, if I see someone like usually a tourist in Cambodia wearing a red krama, I kind of like get a little shocked. But like the last time I was there, I felt like I saw a lot of older people wearing the red krama, but it was like a reclamation sort of thing, like it's
Yeah.
okay to wear it again, which I think is really nice. And I remember during my PhD research in Siem Reap, we were interviewing this old man and he's wearing these like leather sandals. And
The
then
tire ones.
I don't know if they were Thai, but my
No, the
research,
tires. So they used to cut out
oh
rubber to
yeah, no,
make,
no, it's
yeah, yeah,
that,
those
yeah.
ones. Yeah.
But my research partner Saram called them, well, I also being superior called them spajang Kmakahom, so like Khmer shoes. Because they
Yeah.
wear these really intense sandals, and the old guy was like laughing. He's like, "Yeah, I know the Khmer Rouge sandals, but they're so good. They're so hardy. I can walk through like a bed of thorns." So you can see that
But
kind of interplay with how 50 years, still very painful, still recovering as a whole nation and diaspora around it, but we can see them like people undoing that trauma and progressing
yeah.
forward.
And I would say that this focus right now that is happening in Cambodia on the foods and the space around reviving foods and forgotten foods is a little bit of that because you have a cultural food heritage, which yes has some couching in famine foods, but it predates that some of it. This plant knowledge is from before that. So I'm seeing this also as a reclaiming of kind of, yeah, okay, fine, we had it during Khmer Rouge and we really used it, but it is before that, it's not a, I think that's why maybe perhaps not a lot of research was done on this before that time.
Yeah, so I was thinking about like from an anthropological perspective, how one of the first ethnographies done in Cambodia was by May Ebihara in the 60s, like right before the Khmer Rouge, and it was like an ethnography of a Khmer village. This is like kind of that seminal text where people are like, oh, that's what Cambodia is like, right? This mythical place. And it is quite a beautiful mythical place. But when we think about food, it's still limited. And to some extent, when we don't have many English language cookbooks with Khmer food, and Chef Nak is definitely one of those people who spearheaded that information. And she did do all these interviews with different people to kind of, on their own terms, explain what their regional cuisines were like. And a lot of these, traditional practices include drying and fermentation, like trenyet, like Khmer dried fish, right? So many different kinds and all the different pickles and things like that are there. But that's kind of an inevitability of being in a tropical country, right? To some extent. There's a book that I've been really dying to read about the history of refrigeration and how it changes the way we interact with food. Let me find it. I think it was the London Review of Books that did a review of it, and it's called, okay, Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. And I think that when we look at Cambodia's foodscape and what our food identity is or could be, it's really colored by the Khmer Rouge experience and sort of, yeah, like very much acted as like famine foods, survival foods. And that's an important part of its history, but it was also so much more than that, as you said. Um,
And I feel
And
like
one,
when people politically or when you're socially coming out of that time, you really want to reject that. Like you don't want anything to do with it. So there might have been a couple of decades or so, late early 2000s or something, where some people didn't want to engage in it. So it sort of went under the radar. But because it was either like, I don't know, too close to home or it reminded them too much of that time. But now you're sort of seeing a more like going back to basics or revival or as I mean Chef Nak, we can link her into this podcast too in the description, is one of the celebrity chefs of Cambodia now. And she's written two cookbooks doing different cuisines in English and in Khmer, so she's making it accessible. And it's really for diaspora visitors, people that come to Cambodia, people who don't know the cuisine, because that's another thing. Not a lot of people know Cambodian food.
yeah, and there's been, and I've written about this and we've discussed it throughout the podcast, but there's been an initiative by the Cambodian government to really work on its gastro diplomacy. So, like culinary diplomacy, gastro diplomacy, food diplomacy, whatever you want to call it, like the sort of extension of different types of power or at least influence that a country may have on the global stage just through their cuisine. I remember I had a friend go to Cambodia and he's like, yeah, Cambodian food, not very interesting. And then starts to talk about how much he loved Thai food more or Vietnamese food. And I was like, but it's not those things. Like
Yeah.
they're by. And like I kind of like because he's also diaspora as well, I kind of wanted to be like, yikes, like we're all different, you know. You wouldn't say all West African cuisine is the same. You can't say all Southeast Asian cuisine is the same. He wasn't saying that directly, but for me, when I was hearing
Yeah,
it, I was like,
yeah.
skip over Cambodia or something. I
And
was like,
also, I
oh.
think it's like you might have eaten two things fine that you might not have liked them, but you don't write off cuisines, you know. I mean, there's so much, I would say Indian, Pakistani, South Indian food, um, and some is good and some is bad, but that's food.
Yeah, and speaking of food, you know, in the context of Khmer Rouge, but also the time of year. So what one thing is like when we opened this podcast, we talked about how it's Khmer New Year. And Khmer New
Yes.
Year is multiple days, by the way. It's like 3 days. And it
Mm,
starts with an ascension of or a descension of angels, the Tevi, the Aspera, and they receive our altar blessings. And what's on this altar? There's fruit, there's incense, and there's all these different types of food. You've been in Cambodia when it's Songkran, so what did you
I
see
have.
over there?
So I remember a lot of kind of preparation in terms of decorating the house, cleaning, and sort of creating some making. So I remember visiting a family actually last year in Udarminche in the province, and they were all gathered around outside making angsom, so making the pork stuffed rice and then wrapping it in banana leaf to either steam it. And so yeah, so they were getting ready for their family gathering that would be happening later in the day. But I think it was just making sort of snack food, but lots of it. People do barbecues and have a lot of alcohol. I mean, that's what I remember. And then they fire up their water guns or whatever that they're gonna douse people with water with. And that's usually when I go and sit inside because I don't like to be getting a dousing of water.
That's super funny because like when I was in Cambodia, unfortunately during COVID, I had anticipated earlier that year, I'd be like, I'm gonna be in Cambodia for Songkran. This is gonna be amazing. And my friend was like, oh, just don't wear white on New Year's, you know, because you're just gonna be see-through because of all of the different water guns that the kids are running around. So like growing up in diaspora, I think of Nom Som as like a perfect New Year food because it's also for Vietnamese Lunar New Year that I also eat Nom Som, but
Ah,
it's called bánh chưng, and it's got like pork in it and beans. But there's also many different versions of it. I in my brain, I just think like, oh, it's like sticky rice, and you can fill it with many different things, either savory or sweet. Like I think there's a banana one as well. Um, but either
yes.
way, like sticky rice. really important during New Year's. And I think it's because it's like this kind of beautiful thing that is steamed and then sliced and divided, looks good on the altar. This is what I'm arguing, that it's just aesthetically very pleasing.
Yeah. It
Um,
was, sorry to interrupt, but I remember reading this, but I didn't know the exact details. But in April 2015, so now almost 10 years ago, Cambodia set a Guinness World Record for making the largest sticky rice cake, which weighed 4,040 kilograms. So that's a
mhm.
lot of rice going into this large cake. It was created by 100 chefs over 2 days to celebrate the Cambodian New Year. So you can sort of see not just the importance of this snack, but it includes rice. So you see the importance of the rice. And I think the other thing is it is this idea that it is a stepwise process. So somebody does the filling and somebody does the wrapping and somebody does the kind of steaming. So even this sort of activity is an indication of the group work involved in making this cake. But yeah, I do quite like it.
I'd like to do more research, personal research, just because I'm curious on the sort of historical backdrop of Nôm Som. Because, like, I remember when I was doing research for Lunar New Year in Vietnam, the different ingredients of the bánh revolved into like the earth, the sky, and things like that. So I was
Oh,
wondering if there's a similar analogy to be made with Nôm Som. I'm pretty sure there is. I'll have to look it up for next time. But growing up with my wat in Maryland, the Cambodian Buddhist Society, we would have so many different kinds of food, but I think of them as Khmer street food. So we'd have patio, right? We would have salam chu sometimes. We would have salakari. We would have nupchuk. Just like sort of these easier, kind of larger things to serve in mass.
yeah. Cooking in
Um,
big pots, serving many people, because that's also what happens during like festival time.
Yeah, and then everyone's cooking for the monks, of course. And you've got these really silver platters and fruit and things as they eat first. And I feel like if anyone has ever been to Southeast Asia, like eating things off a stick, the best thing. So it's like eating things off a stick, usually meat. And then you have some pickles like papaya maklahong. So
Hmm.
I think those are very like Khmer oriented New Year dishes for me in my brain. But like a quick little search, I wanted to see if there's any other different foods that I could possibly be missing in my analysis. And they said that like hot pot, yahon, is also very popular during New
Okay.
Year's. But I didn't personally think of it as a New Year's food, but I guess it makes sense because everyone gathers together.
Gathers, yeah. And it could, I mean, it could also be a slightly Chinese or Lunar New Year influence where it's just sort of a preference that sometimes these eating habits change because of what we're doing at other times around the year. And yeah, and I guess I'm sure there are individual families with their own specific kind of traditions that we might have missed. I have not been in Cambodia a lot during Khmer New Year. Last year was the first time in over 10 years that I've been there. And I think simply because it's the time where not much work takes place. So I actually avoid that time of the year because it would just be, in terms of work, it would not be effective for the charity for me to be there during the holidays. But kind of wanted to experience it. I wanted to see a slowed down city because the other thing that we forgot to mention, a lot of people go out to visit their province, so the cities are quiet. The cities are very sort of low in terms of activity and traffic and busyness. So during for these 3 days or 4 days, there are most people that go away to the province to visit grandparents or where their family kind of are, yeah, temples are.
Yeah, so they're visiting their families, they're getting more acquainted with nature, they're just going home, right? And they're eating all these foods that are quite replicable around the country, but they also include many different local herbs and vegetables in this process. So once
Hmm.
again, the knowledge around these wild foods become, more important. It's not always the case, but when you have hope and lo and other things, local vegetables, local herbs are really important. And another thing that I wanted to kind of throw back to our field work is that they play Ongkon, the
Oh,
game where you work with the
yes.
seeds. So the Ongkon tree is a tree species called, I think it's Gardenia ancarensis. and it's native
Oh, I
to Cambodian Lao. I mean, don't quote me on that exactly, but I feel like when I was preparing for this podcast, I was like, that is the shrub slash tree that where these larger seeds come from. So the game Bakangkun, you have two teams of people and you have these little seeds from a tree. They're quite large. They're how many centimeters do you think they are across? Like
ooh,
in diameter?
6. Oh,
Yeah, six.
I have a ruler here. Let me check.
Perfect.
About 6. Yeah, about
Yeah,
six,
okay.
5 to 6. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
so this
quite
game,
heavy. Yeah,
yeah, they're quite heavy, but essentially what they do is they
hefty.
put them in the ground and then everyone takes their shot at like knocking the other one over with another seed. So that's a perfect example of how knowledge around specific local plants can be very useful within the context of Khmer New Year, because is it really New Year's if you're not getting soaked in water with water guns or playing gun? I don't know, because
No,
Surin was very happy to forage and collect a lot of unggun seeds.
yeah. Also, the high school students that we went to the monk forest with, they were collecting bags. I have 6 seeds, some of them which I'm donating to National Geographic because of just the significance. We're both donating a few, but yeah, maybe this Khmer New Year I could try a little game with them. And I think it's yeah, it sort of again sort of shows this idea of including some form of a plant into a part of the festival, and it's just used for games. It's like I guess a Western example of it would be Conkers, like here in the UK. I've heard about it a lot. I've never played it, but I think they play a lot of Conkers, which is the same. It's from a tree as well, and it's a seed. But yeah, but I think a Khmer New Year game using bong bok gong. I can't say it. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. So I guess I'd like to wrap up the podcast if that's okay, but just kind of doing an overview. So now we have a history of foraging, we have sort of, the importance of agriculture and the shift of the contextual importance of different foraged foods. There was a period of them being kind of forgotten because of, not even because of agriculture, but also globalization and rapid development, because people are just spending less time outdoors and it becomes less important. And then, unfortunately, through things like the Khmer Rouge regime and genocide, this had become important once again for more sinister reasons, but nonetheless revalorized in terms of, heritage and identity and survival. And just kind of wrapped around to talk about Khmer New Year and how all of these different things are interlinked. So we did the foraging part, we did the famine part, and then we ended with the feasting part. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Lindsay?
No, I think that's all. So, Chul Chnam Thmai, Happy Khmer New Year. And yes, it's an odd linking of things, but I think it works. And I feel like it also helps us remember this idea of how sort of nature and food guides us through how we celebrate and what we eat and where we are.
Yeah, so my everyone. Have a wonderful
Okay.
time. Eat lots of things, reflect, but also just enjoy. And we'll get back to
Okay.
you next time. So,
Thank
bye-bye.
you. Bye bye.